I had a lot of plant lists to share with you, and I'm sorry that, I do that. Sometimes I just get really excited and I make a lot of plant lists about things I enjoy. But this week
Yes.
will be a lot more focusing on insects and the role native plants play with insects. So we'll get into some more information instead of plant lists this week.
Michaela, I have a question, and you talked about it a little bit last week.
Mhm.
A lot of these nurseries you go to, oh, we're native plants. We're native plants.
Right.
But how do you know if they're really native plants? You have to do your research and look at like the list that you provide and other lists that we get. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. One resource I highly recommend for Marylanders is this book. It's called Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping. It's kind of a long name. You can get hard copies of this, but it's also available for free online. Both in like the text like that, but also as a searchable database. So you can actually look at plant names, like say you're at the nursery, you can look at plant names and see whether they're native or not to your region even. They're broken down by mountain, Piedmont, and coastal plain, and we're coastal plain.
See and hear you.
And I'm actually going to put the link to that in the chat box real quick because I think it's a really handy tool. Now, keeping in mind that there's a lot more native plants that are not included in that book, but it's probably a good compilation of the most common ones you're going to find.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Okay.
And also, I like to say, if you're talking to the people at the nursery, if they're a good, reputable nursery, their staff should also be able to talk some about that. Like they should be aware of what their inventory is. But I can't speak for every nursery, of course, because some of the bigger box stores, whose names I shall not name, they may not be as well versed in that kind of topic.
I know the mail has been really informative for me.
What's been really informative?
The mill in Queen Anne's County.
The mill.
Just bordering the Chester River Bridge.
Yes. Okay.
That's
good to know.
And then the Unity on
Unity is very good.
That's
they're well versed in their plants as well. Yeah.
Very really are. I bought stevia plant a couple of years ago, and it was tart, but it worked very, very good. And tea, it infused itself into the tea.
Nice.
You're probably better off than me.
No, it's okay.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ned.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. Glad you can hear us. All right.
Jean's here too, but she's muted.
Oh, that's good.
She was.
I'm on the other side of the room.
Can't share computers. I understand. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of good information to deal with today. And if I have to skip around a little bit, I apologize. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to try and keep it focused. But I know last week we talked a lot more about planting for different conditions. But now I'm going to spend this week talking a lot more about native plants and their role, not just for pollinators and insects, but for other beneficial insects. We'll talk about what that means. And then just wildlife in general, because of course, native plants, that's one of their advantages, or that we like to talk about, is that they play such a critical role in supplying habitat and food and all sorts of nurturing things for our wildlife. And so we'll talk about that this week. But we'll also talk about next week, the planting for the seasons. And that's going to be a little bit more about what's in bloom when, which is also actually very critical for pollinators and insects, because of course, if you have something bloom just at one time of the year, you aren't supplying any food for them for the rest of the season. So that's why it's really important to sort of stagger those different blooms across different seasons. All right, so one of the things, of course, that I enjoy the most about native plants is that they do have this relationship with our wildlife. And now we're very it's very common to think of it in terms of, oh, I want beautiful butterflies, and that's great. We have a lot of native plants that do that, but there's so many other insects and wildlife that play these underrated roles in the landscape that we don't often see, but they have really high value. I was actually thrilled this was last spring. I found a box turtle in one of my garden beds. After living in my house for, I don't know, 7 years, I hadn't seen any turtles on my property. And then one day, of course, I was weeding and I came across this little box turtle, and it was just the highlight of my year. Because of course, wildlife is partly why I am so interested in plants. If our plants don't play a role or they don't support something in the environment, for me, it doesn't, it doesn't matter then. What are we doing if we're not trying to sort of give back to the creatures that also use our properties? And so, of course, talking about bees and butterflies, but also some of those underrated wildlife like turtles, really important because we can build these habitats in our home to help support that. All right. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of things that may not be popular today, and that's fine. Not everybody's going to operate the same way. But what I am going to kind of encourage people to think about is bucking these standards that we have in landscape care and maintenance. Often we're creating what we think are very pristine and elaborate landscapes that need to be cleaned up and things like that. But honestly, doing less in your yard sometimes benefits more. So we're going to talk about why we want to leave the leaves, why cutting back perennials should be left until spring and not fall like they're usually done, leaving hollow stems and cavities, and then just sort of building natural gardens that kind of can support some of this ecosystem. So when we mow our lawns or when we scrape away all of the leaves or cut back all of our perennials, we're essentially taking away all of the beneficial items that insects and wildlife still use. They use them throughout the winter. So we'll get into more detail about that, but I am giving you permission to be a lazy gardener. And what I like to say is you're being an ecological gardener. You're not lazy. It's just that you're supporting good ecology. And if you can remove parts of your lawn that you aren't using and put them into planted landscapes. Doesn't even have to be essentially well maintained. Just putting in native plants, having that variety we talked about. I'm going to talk about biodiversity again today, so I apologize if I repeat myself, but these are just really good points to sort of drive home. And just like us humans or any other animal, insects do have needs, and so they need food, shelter, and water. And we can sort of encourage their populations by creating these things or creating spaces that support them. So selecting plants, not just flowers, but there are lots of other plants that can be food for our insects. Shelter could be as simple as having some nesting sites, or, when we don't cut back our perennials in the fall, those are nesting sites and overwintering habitat for insects and birds. And so creating that environment, and we're not even creating it, we're just leaving it and letting it sort of provide for our wildlife. And then if you can, doing a fresh water source. And this is sometimes tricky because, of course, if you're not on top of it, you can have like mosquito larvae get in there and stuff. But if you have a bird bath or a fresh water fixture in your landscape, that can be really beneficial as well. Because even though we're surrounded by water, insects need fresh water. They can't drink, of course, our brackish waters. So, and actually this little bird bath that's in the picture has a bunch of stones in it, and that's on purpose. That's not just to make it look pretty. But but bees and smaller insects actually need a landing site. So they can't just dip in like a dragonfly can dip in and get water, but not all insects have that mobility when it comes to flying. And so they need a place to land in order to kind of lap up the water. So that's why even if you have a bowl with like marbles in it, and then like you fill it with water, as long as those marbles are kind of poking out so something can land on it, that's another really great, easy way to provide fresh water source. And, you know, it's not just about bees and butterflies, although they tend to get the most attention because they're the most showy. We have so many other beneficial insects that we don't even think about. Flies, and I'm not talking about like horse flies, because I obviously, you know, I'm not a big fan of those either. But there's a lot of flies, like the one in the picture on the right, that's a syrphid or flower fly. The larva of this fly actually is really good predator, and it eats a lot of aphids. And so this is something you really do want to encourage and have on your property. The beetle on the left, the beetles belong to the largest group of insects on the planet. So I think it's over 10,000 species of beetles. And that's one of them is goldenrod soldier beetle. And this is another one that's a really good pollinator. It's also a really good predator, and it will help control kind of the smaller soft-bodied species that create problems like aphids. And we have so many other natural predators that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but just, you know, some fun facts about insects in Maryland. We have over 400 species of native bees. Many of them don't even have names yet, which is really fascinating. And native bees are often specialist pollinators. So they only may pollinate one group of plants or even one species of plant. And so this is where I'm going to talk about biodiversity again. If we can supply more species of plants, we can actually have a wider variety of insects as well. It kind of makes sense, right? They go hand in hand. And these native bees also do not have a social hierarchy. So they're not like honeybees. They don't have one queen and then like a hive that works towards making honey and building those comb. They're actually solitary. And so you'll have mother and daughter bees, and that's pretty much about it. They do make male bees as well, but they don't hang out together. And so that they don't sting, or they aren't inclined to protect their property like honeybees are. And so it's very hard to get a native bee to sting you, short of, you know, trying to crush it in your hand. And I'm not sure even then that they would sting you. You know, these are good things to have. So what I'm saying is, don't worry so much about attracting bees because you're afraid about getting stung or having that risk. Honestly, the benefits outweigh so much more, and very, very rare occasion that you would be stung by any of those. Okay, I covered this a little bit in the last session, but I'm going to talk about it again. And these are this is a list compiled by Doug Tallamy's work. He was a professor at the University of Delaware. Some of you may know of him. He's very popular, very, very well known. But he did this study about researching how many lepidopteran species, that means caterpillars and butterflies, okay? So how many butterfly species can be found on these different plant groups throughout the mid-Atlantic. And what we found is that oaks are an incredible source of support, not only for lepidopterans or butterflies, but for all wildlife. So think about all the acorns and all the other benefits that they provide. But just one species, or this one group of plants, 534 species of caterpillars, is pretty incredible. So when we think about using native plants in the landscape, I like to think about, well, how many species are they also going to support? So on the other side, perennials, of course, that doesn't seem like much, but remember the biomass of a tree compared to a perennial plant, it still has a really big impact. So if you're going to plant things that have the most bang for their buck, doing goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, bone sets, these are all really great power plants in terms of supporting both butterflies and caterpillars, but also bees as well. We'll find that these plants make a lot of our lists for bee activity as well. And I quizzed you on this last week, but I like to pick on some ornamental plants, so I'm going to do it again. So when we think about in terms of oak trees compared to crepe myrtles, I think we talked about how crepe myrtle only has one species of caterpillar that it supports compared to the 534 species that the oaks do. Now let's compare blueberry shrubs to boxwoods, which are roughly about the same size. How many species of caterpillars do you think boxwoods support? Blueberry has an incredible amount. 288 is quite a lot for being pretty small shrub, really. If anybody wants to guess, it's one. It's also one. So not a lot. And boxwoods have their own set of problems that I won't even cover today. But you know, if we're talking about asters and goldenrod, they provide about 115 species compared to Nandina, which is 0. So again, I like to pick on Nandina because it also has been proven, or there's been research about how the berries of Nandina can be toxic to birds in large quantities. And so even though we're attracted to them for their bright red berries, they actually don't provide that many benefits. In fact, many detriments in some ways. Okay, so here's my first plant list here. So if I'm talking about ranking plants in terms of bird activity, of course, looking at these woody trees for caterpillars are incredibly important for bird families and populations because they require those soft-bodied caterpillars to feed their young. Their young cannot process some of the exoskeletons of the larger insects. And so that's why we kind of tie caterpillars with high bird activity, is because they need all those soft-bodied insects to feed their young. And so if we're looking at caterpillars, you know, oaks, cherries, willows, birch, and poplar, those top 5 plants or top 5 trees for caterpillars. But on the flip side, birds also need berry producing plants because they need something that's going to be high in fat and proteins to get them through winter. So you'll notice the top 3 shrubs for producing those things, or the most popular, are dogwoods. These are shrub dogwoods, not the tree dogwood, just so you know. But then we have a viburnum and Virginia creeper, of all things, which is actually a vine that many people don't like, but I actually am partial to it. But that's where you'll notice they have the really dark, big berries, very good, very high in proteins and fats for those birds who are trying to survive winter. Okay, so what are some things we can do as homeowners to provide for our wildlife? We can focus on the type of plants that we're placing into the landscape and providing that seasonal variety, which we'll talk about next week a little bit. So we want a variety of colors, shapes, heights, and species that flower throughout those different seasons to provide nectar, pollen, and berries. And a little bit goes a long way, so that no matter the size of the property or budget, planting even just a few native plant species to make that. Remember, we talked about how even just one oak tree could make a huge impact. So even just a few specimens is helpful. And sort of our duty as consumers, using native plant species and trying to avoid those invasive plant species that are still legal to buy, but may be very detrimental to our ecosystems. So many species are marketed as attracting beneficial insects and pollinators, but try to use native plants when possible. So things like butterfly bush. I know that's really popular. And if you have one, you know, that's okay. I'm not saying go out back and try and pull it out. But despite the name, this plant is not as nutritional or beneficial as some of the native plant alternatives. And it's sort of the equivalent of giving giving someone Diet Coke instead of something that's more nutritious and filling. So even though it's sugary and attractive to them, it doesn't give them the nutritional benefits. And if you can, avoiding pesticide use, you can control pests using some alternative methods. Also, by encouraging these natural pests and beneficial insects, they're going to predate on some of these pest populations and help control them for you. But if you must use a pesticide, avoid using them between the times of 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and try not to use them on flowering plants because, of course, they're going to be our pollinators are going to be attracted to those flowering plants during the day for the most part. So just make sure you're following the label and using them at off periods. Okay, I'm actually going to cover this next week a little bit, so I'm going to skip ahead. Some other planting tips, like I said, planting those different species, types, different ages even will be really beneficial. You want a mix of heights because insects, they can sometimes see or they focus in on different heights, depending on how small they are and depending on, where they're looking for resources. So different flower types, flower shapes, colors. Basically, I'm telling you, get a rainbow of colors that do across all seasons, not just for us, but for insects as well. And if you can, using regional native plants when possible. I know Denise asked the question right before we got started about how do we know if a plant is native or not? And I put a link in the chat box that I'll be happy to share with a follow-up today. But that's a nice little tool to be able to kind of look up a plant species and see if it's native to both Maryland and where we are located, which is in the coastal plain. So it's a helpful tip. All right, for plant recommendations, and actually I have quite a few plants on this list that are non-native as well as native because they still attract a good variety of insects and they are nutritious. So I'm not saying all non-native plants are bad, but there are some that are worse than others. So a lot of things in the carrot family, and that's because carrot flowers are very small. And that means it's accessible to a lot of different types of insects. So they don't need a specialized tongue or, a beak or something that can reach way, way down into like a long tubular flower. And you'll notice a lot of the more popular flowers tend to be flowers that are very, very small. And that's because we have a variety of bees that are both long-tongued and what we call short-tongued. And so some tongues don't reach very far. And so they need to be able to access these flowers. So a lot of things in the carrot family, of course, the mint family is going to be super popular. And one of my favorites to plant in my vegetable garden is actually Thai basil. And I'm telling you, you should try it because not only is it really fragrant, but it attracts all kinds of flower flies and bees. It's really neat. I have some of my best bee pictures on Thai basil. And then things in the legume family is always a good idea too, because not only do they have kind of a cool flower, but they also fix nitrogen. So, they're very hardy when it comes to adverse environments. And then the aster family is a very large family. So you should be able to pick pretty much anything in this group, but sunflowers, asters, and goldenrods and black-eyed Susans all belong to this group. So asters are always, and some of the non-native asters included zinnias, marigolds, cosmos, calendula. Those are all non-native, but they're also really good for insects. The downside is that they're annuals, so you have to just plant them over and over again every year, but that's fine. They're very happy plants. So if we're talking in terms of native bee interactions, so this is the amount of times this was calculated by the amount of times bees visited these flowers. And so the top 5 plants that we kind of found for that is bergamot, which is a type of bee balm. It was actually in one of my first pictures, the plant that was in there is like a lavender flower. Black-eyed Susans. Interesting fact about black-eyed Susans. Bees can actually see in what we call ultraviolet light. And we don't see in that spectrum, of course, but black-eyed Susans have flower petals that have almost what we call like a runway strip of ultraviolet light. And so bees can identify those flowers from very far away. And it's kind of like lights directing them in for landing. Like, I have food, come here, come pollinate me. So black-eyed Susans are really cool in that respect, that they just have this ultraviolet light landing strip for bees. It's just a really neat plant. Now, purple prairie clover is the only thing that is not native to Maryland. It's native to the Midwest, but it's kind of a cool plant. So if you wanted to try a non-native, that might be a really cool one. And now this list for predatory wasps, I don't want people to pull away, because when I say predatory wasp, I mean they predate on other insects, not us. They aren't interested in us at all. This does not include paper wasps and yellow jackets. Okay. Now, those are a whole different group that I'm not going to talk about, but there's all these other wasps that are super beneficial. And so common boneset, mountain mint, goldenrods, you'll notice that those are frequented by a lot of these cool wasps that will help control pest populations in the landscape. So I always encourage you to incorporate those into your planting if you can. Here are just a selection of some of the insects that you're going to see if you plant some of these things. Let me get my pointer out here. This is my favorite bee of all time. It's called the longhorned bee. It's the cutest thing you've ever seen. And I learned after I took this picture that the male bees, because these are solitary bees, you know, the females, you know, they mate and then they go build a nest to lay their eggs, but the male bees don't know what to do with themselves. And so they'll actually congregate like this and sleep on flower stems by clasping them with their jaws and their legs. And they'll just sleep in groups like this. I don't know if they're lonely or what, but oh man, it is cute. So this is blue mist flower, which is in the mint family. So, you know, very popular with the insects. And then we have two different kind of bees on this picture. One's a leaf cutter bee, and you can tell because it has huge jaws. In order to cut out little circles into leaves, they actually use those and fold them and put them in their nests. They make their nests with them. And then of course a bumblebee in the bottom right here. And they're on a milkweed. So not only is the milkweed supporting monarch activity, but it's very popular with wasps and bees as well. So that's another power plant that will give you a lot of different species support. Mountain mint is another one that's incredible for a wide variety of species. In fact, I took a video once of my mountain mint, and I swear I counted over like 60 different species of insect just in one pan, one visit. This is actually called a potter wasp. So what they do is they build their nests out of mud. It's not a mud dauber. It's a little bit different. They create like a circular pot of mud, and then they stuff them with like spiders for their eggs, so that when their eggs hatch, they eat the spiders. It's really interesting stuff. And then there's our goldenrod beetle again, which will visit many different kinds of flowers. Now, if you're interested in getting certain types of butterfly onto your property or into landscapes, there's a lot of caterpillars that are very specific host plants that are associated with them. So again, the classic example is monarch. The monarch caterpillar can only feed on plants in the milkweed family. Now the butterfly, the adult butterfly, can feed on anything it wants, but the caterpillar itself needs to process milkweeds, which is really interesting because milkweed contains a latex sap in it that is toxic to many other insects. And so insects that are well adapted to milkweeds do it very well. And in fact, those caterpillars are now toxic to anything that tries to eat them. So birds usually understand, if they're old enough, to avoid the caterpillars because it'll make them throw up, basically. But we have so many other butterflies, like the spicebush swallowtail butterfly, gorgeous species. Black swallowtail is one that's very common because it not only feeds on carrot and dill, but it'll also feed on anything in the carrot family. That's the thing that shows up and eats your parsley or your carrot overnight. And that's okay. Just plant a little extra, you know, they're good to have. Yeah, so lots of other of these species associated very tightly with only a few species of plant, or sometimes only one. I think the one I have an example of. So here's the monarch again. Just like in this picture, the adult can feed on any kind of flowering plant it wants, but it needs the milkweed in order to lay its eggs and for the caterpillars to kind of thrive. Very distinctive looking caterpillar. This one is also very distinctive. It's such a cool insect. Okay, this is the painted lady, or I'm sorry, not painted lady, variegated fritillary. And it has the coolest chrysalis you've ever seen. It almost doesn't look real. It looks like an alien pod from outer space that was sent here, but it's metallic in color. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know. But it contains sort of these iridescent metallic colors to it. And this is the caterpillar. Doesn't it look funky? I mean, it looks like a clown or something. It's very specific to passion flower vine. And the other plant it frequents is mayapple, which we have a lot of around here. So hopefully you keep your eyes out or your eyes peeled and you can find some of these caterpillars. They're really neat. They are not poisonous, but I don't encourage anybody to handle them unless you absolutely have to. Wear gloves. Okay. So some of these other tasks we can do at home in providing shelter. So providing a variety of nesting grounds. So bees and other beneficial insects all require different kinds of nesting sites. Could be decomposing plant matter, undisturbed soil. Like I said, native bees are often split into the group of either cavity dwelling or ground nesting. And so some will nest underground. You'll see holes in the ground. They'll make their little nests down there. And some require hollow cavities like carpenter bees, which I know a lot of people don't like, but they are a prime example of where they need a cavity. So they actually drill a hole into wood to lay their eggs and to raise their young. But 70% of our bees are mostly ground dwelling or ground nesting. So when we do a lot of soil disturbance, that can affect their nesting grounds. Also, they are really dependent on a layer of leaves in the winter to provide them with that extra layer of warmth. And when we remove all of those leaves, essentially we're taking away all of that warmth for them. We're taking away the insulating layer. Another good thing to keep in, not just bees, but a lot of our beetle larvae and pupa can spend years pupating in the soils. So the more that we disturb them, the more that we kind of disturb that regime, and we can actually take out beneficial beetles out of the landscape as well. Snags, dead wood. I know a lot of people fear carpenter ants and things like that, but if you have the amount of property that can support leaving dead wood, you know, bring it further away from the house and leave those, because there's a lot of insects that decompose wood and actually rely on it to create their nests as well. So fallen logs are good for ground beetles, spiders, other natural insect predators. But you know, like if you have a snag and it's a hazard to human health or structures, of course you need to take it down. That always comes first. Safety first. Another thing people don't think about is brush or rock piles. They may seem untidy, but they are essential hibernation sites and bird retreats. So birds often, the smaller birds in particular, in order to escape their predators or other predatory birds, they actually will find refuge in brush piles. And that's a nice place for them to hide. But they'll also nest in there as well. But you can make it aesthetic. You could do a rock pile that's more structural, or it's like a sculpture instead of, you know, functional, but you know, you can interpret it many other ways. Another thing I like to say is mulch consciously. So, you know, using a mulch that is organic, so it's hardwood or something that will decompose over time, not dyed, so it doesn't have weird colors in it. Don't use rubber mulch, or that landscape fabric. Landscape fabric doesn't break down in the environment, and it ends up just being trapped under the soil surface. And then eventually you're going to try and dig a hole and you will find that fabric and you'll have to pull it all up, and it's really a pain. It really doesn't have many benefits to it. All right, so here's some examples of shelter. I actually thought this was a really clever idea. I don't know if it's a stump or just a log that's standing upright, but someone drilled holes into it. Mason bees in particular, I think they like the size 3/8 of an inch, I think. So someone just drilled all of those holes in. That's a perfect mason bee log. And then once it's done, you know, once they have laid their eggs and the young have emerged, you can actually use that log, throw it in the fireplace or what have you. So once the young are out of there, essentially you can get rid of the log if you want. Some people make these mason bee houses with like bamboo, cut pieces of bamboo. That's a great activity to do with kids or grandkids. And here, these are called bumblebee honey pots. And they're kind of like a waxy substance that they make. And these are kind of like chambers to lay their eggs, and they raise their young. Honeybees are kind of funny. They're what we call eusocial. So they're sort of social. They'll have several queens all nesting sort of together to create this like honeypot village. And sometimes the sisters and the daughters of those bumblebees will help tend one another's young, but they are not more prone to stinging than like a honeybee or anything like that. It's just a really fascinating social structure that we don't think about. So 30% of our bees actually are cavity nesting. So that's what we call this. Anything in the logs or in hollowed stems, that's cavity dwelling. You can use wood blocks with holes in it, hollow stems, cut bamboo pieces. Those are great environments. Leaf cutter bees and mason bees are the biggest group of cavity nesting insects. So if I think this graphic, the infographic on the right is great. It was put out by Xerxes Society. It helps you kind of understand why you want to leave the stems or the cut stems of your perennials, and that even leaving them for up to 2 years is beneficial because they can use them that whole time. And actually those stems still break down over time. It's not like they last forever. So you know, they do decompose, but they'll actually make chambers in those hollow stems, lay their eggs, and then of course the adult bees will emerge from those over the course of time. Isn't that is a cute little bee butt? Who doesn't want to see that? Here's a good example again of the carpenter bee. Because it's such a large bee, it's fascinating to study because it's so large. So you'll see they build different chambers within this hollowed out cavity. And you'll see different stages of insect in there. So this one's almost completely done pupating. This one is still in the larval stage. They don't have any egg pictures in here, but this is actually a bee bread. It's a concoction of nectar and pollen that they sort of put together in their gut, and then they sort of spit it out. And then they pack the chambers with this bee bread so that when larvae hatch, they have something to eat. Really interesting. And sometimes you can tell whether a cavity has an insect in it or a bee larva in it because they will cap it off with mud, or they'll fill it. And then once the adults break out, you know, that mud will be knocked out. You'll be able to see whether those cavities still have something in it or not, whether the mud is capped on there. And this is my little PSA about leaving the leaves. we often don't think about critters using leaf litter, but it's a really important thing. Can you spot the creature in this picture? Can you see what it is? So it looks like a leaf. It looks like a crumpled up leaf. That's actually a little red bat. It's the most common, actually, I think little brown bat's the most common in Maryland, but it's one of our prominent species in Maryland is the little red bat. And sometimes they'll roost in trees, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll roost in leaf litter and actually can hibernate in those spaces as well. So I'm not saying every pile of leaf litter has a bat in it, but it's very possible that it could. They also need a warm protected space in winter. And this, I know it just looks like a crumpled up, rolled up leaf, but this is actually the cocoon of one of our larger species of moths. So Luna moth, anything in the giant silkworm family. So that's Luna moth, the Polyphemus moth, Cercopia moth, those large, really prominently brightly colored moths, almost all of them cocoon in leaf litter. So when we rake our leaf litter away, who knows how many cocoons or caterpillars or whatever pupa are in that leaf litter that you just took away. I'm so excited because I just found a cocoon the other day laying in my driveway. I don't even know how it got there, but it's wrapped in a leaf. And so I've put it in a very special place and I'm going to try and capture whatever comes out of it. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm pretty excited about it. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about bumblebees because they are ground nesting. They rely on that leaf litter to keep them warm, especially through the winter time. And remember, so a lot of bees die off when it comes to wintertime, but all of the mated queens for most bees are the ones that overwinter and shelter. So that's mostly who uses the leaf litter. The males die off, I'm sorry to say. Sorry, gentlemen. All right, and then so ground beetles, I just cover them very briefly because they're the unsung hero of the environment. So these are predatory beetles, and both in their larval and adult form, so they can actually help control pests in both forms. Providing habitat for them, perennial habitat for them is essential. And it can be part of a biocontrol program for both agricultural fields and our backyards. Avoiding the use of pesticides is critical in these areas because beetles in particular are sort of sensitive to it. A beetle bank is essentially an undisturbed habitat refuge. So a bunch of bunches or native grasses. They call them a bank because you'll see it's kind of like a mound. And that's used in a lot of agricultural fields, or it can be, where they'll actually have strips of undisturbed soil so that the beetles have this habitat refuge, but then they also can help control pest populations in the crops around them. So a lot of perennial bunch grasses, they can include wildflowers to attract other pollinators and ground dwelling insects. But more grasses harbor beetle activity because they provide better shelter for them. They have more of that clump grass forming shelter instead of wildflowers don't always form that same habitat. So they need access to bare soil in between these bunches of grass, but you do want grasses to be thick enough so you don't have a lot of weed growth. And here, let me show you what a beetle bank looks like. This is it's pretty simple. It's just like a mound of soil planted with a lot of different grasses, sometimes wildflowers, but not totally necessary. And these are strips that are supposed to be undisturbed by pesticides or tilling or any other sort of activity so that those insects have an opportunity to sort of escape cultivation around them. And now I give this as like an agricultural example, but I don't see why it couldn't apply in the landscape as well. It would be pretty easy to do. These banked soils also keep the habitat drier and warmer because of course they have the insulation of the bunch grasses. And if they're sort of mounded, hopefully the drainage is better. I can't promise it if it's in a very wet part of your property, but you know. So Beetles take years to complete their life cycle. In fact, they can spend years as both larva and pupa. And fireflies are a good example of that. They can pupate up to 2 years. So you almost need soil that can't be disturbed for that 2-year period, or they're at risk of getting eaten by something, or not being able to complete their life cycle. So they need this permanent refuge for that larval and pupa stage for a lot longer than one growing season, and certainly a lot longer than our bees and butterflies. So beetles are in a totally different category when it comes to biological care. And I think that's, I think I've reached the end. How am I doing on time? Excellent on time. So that leaves us plenty of room for asking questions. Jean, I see you have a question about mason bee housing. Is there something specific you wanted to know about that?
To point out that it's that it's available, that's all.
Yes. Oh, yes. And in fact, now they're starting to commercially make, hold on, I have a good example right here. So they actually make commercially made mason bee houses. So they look pretty proper, actually. Now, what I will say is what I don't like about this design is you'll see it's open on both sides. That's not good for mason bees because there are things that try to eat the larva. So you almost need like a solid back on one side so that something doesn't, like a bird, doesn't swoop in and try to peck out the caterpillar larva, or I'm sorry, the larva or the pupa. So woodpeckers are famous for that, right? So if this were mounted against a tree or a structure, this would be a great idea. Interesting fact about mason bee houses is a lot of these cavity dwelling bees will put their female larvae and eggs in the way back of the cavity because they have higher survival rates than the larvae that are closer to the outside, because there are things that are going to try come and peck it out. So they sacrifice their male bees so that the female bees can complete their life cycle and emerge. So it's really interesting biology.
I have a question about the carpenter bees as well.
Yeah.
You showed the stump that you drill holes in.
Yes.
Is there any particular wood that's better than others?
Not that I know of. That's a good question. I think especially if you're drilling the holes for them, that they don't have to like excavate themselves. I think you could use anything.
Sure.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I'll have to follow up on that. I'm not sure if they have a preference for it in nature when they have to drill it themselves. Probably softer wood is easier for them to navigate, but I think any hardwood is good enough.
Any wood that's really not aromatic to have maybe put out an odor that would drive them away, like a cherry versus oak versus pine.
Right. And same with red cedar. I'm not sure if
that's pretty aromatic.
It would take red cedar or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good question. So somebody asked about cleaning the mason bee condo out every year. Yes, sanitary wise, that's another mistake the industry sort of makes when they make things like this, is that this is almost impossible to kind of sanitize between broods. But what you can do is you can actually use paper straws, and you can either insert the paper straws here. That makes it really easy to pull them out at the end of the year. Or like I said, if you're doing like a stump and you're drilling holes, once they're done using the stump, because they're a very early season bee, they're active early in the spring and then they're kind of done. You can actually use that to burn. And then that way, you try and find another stump the following year so that it's sort of something brand new. And we do that, or we encourage that, because of disease purposes. And it's just more sanitary. Bees don't like dirty spaces. Bees are actually very clean creatures. So they don't really want to go back to a dirty place to raise their young. It's a good question. Do I have any other questions? This is a heavy topic. I know. I tried to narrow it down to 45 minutes, but there are just so many different insects out there, and I hope this was a good little introduction to not just you know, butterflies and bees, but to sort of the whole spectrum of what you might encounter and why you might want them. But certainly if you have other questions, you can always email me. What I'll do is I will follow up and bring you the recording link for this video, but I'll also send out the PDF again so that you have a copy of the plant list I mentioned. But if anybody has any other questions, again, just let me know. Oh, how do you become certified for a native habitat? So it really depends on, so there's a couple of different companies that have programs that do certification. I think you're probably referring to one of my photos in the very beginning. That was the National Wildlife Federation certification. It's very easy. I think, what was it, 10 questions about the different practices I use on my property. But the thing you do is you end up paying for the sign, basically. But Xerxes Society, you can actually purchase signs without having to go through that certification process. So they have a sign for like leave the leaves, and I think they do have a Be Better certification program, but it really depends on what commercial industry you're working with. How can you attract bats? Oh, good question. So bats, they really, I'll have to follow up with that. That could be a whole different lecture. Joy, I will send you an email and maybe send out to everybody else just a few resources about attracting bats as well. Because bats are cool, man, and they control all of those insects we hate, like mosquitoes.
I have a question regarding controlling mosquitoes. Someone had recommended a certain birdhouse, and I don't remember what the bird was.
Okay.
And I know I can picture the house. It's a big house with, yeah. So do you
Purple, is it purple
yes,
martin by chance?
yes, that's what it was, the
Yeah.
purple martin.
Yeah, they're great, but they also have sort of how do I put it? They're finicky about where their house, like it has to be a certain height, has to be very high, has to
Yeah.
be not surrounded by trees, you know, very open. And you have to be
Okay.
almost careful because there can be some styles of the martin houses that are easier for what is it? The brown sparrow, the house sparrow that likes to come in and kill the young of the
Oh,
purple martin. So, but there are styles out there available that I think is sort of exclusionary to those house sparrows. I'll have to look it up a little bit more. I'm not an avid birder, so I don't always have all the knowledge about it. But yeah, purple swifts or purple martins are really cool too.
okay,
Yeah, we have a
thanks.
purple colony. And it took us years to get the purple martin colony going. And you have to be a dedicated landlord because it does take time in spring and in the fall to, you know, keep them clean, make sure we don't have sparrows. Same with bluebirds. We're avid birders, and we bird trail and we have martin colonies.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Martins definitely have knocked down the mosquitoes we have here. We used to
actually when we first moved here, we had a pond, and you would sit on the porch in the afternoon and the evening and you could hear the mosquitoes. There were so many of them.
Oof.
Now we don't hear them anymore. The martins come in and take care of them.
That's wonderful. And you know what? Same thing with bats. They have sort of tendencies to where their bat houses are located. They also need their bat houses to be, I think it's about 30 feet off the ground. And it has to be a clear approach to the bat house. So there can't be trees nearby. There can't be a thick canopy. They really like to be able to swoop in. They need a clear landing and coming and going site. They also need a freshwater source that's nearby. So, you know, it's like a combination of these things, but it really depends on specifically what you're trying to attract. But I'll try and include some resources for the purple martins and the bats in my follow-up. You guys you have great questions. You're on it this morning. It's a Monday and you've got fantastic questions. So I really appreciate it. And we will reconvene for our very last class next Monday. I'll try and send you a reminder earlier than I did today. I apologize. The Monday got to me apparently. But we'll send out another reminder, and we're going to be covering sort of the seasonality of native plants. But again, if you have any questions in the meantime, just shoot me a message, and otherwise I'll see you next Monday.
Thank you, Michaela.
All right. Thank you guys so much.